This morning, our gospel reading comes from the gospel according to Luke. This is one of his post-resurrection stories and one of my favorite post-resurrection stories. I would invite you to hear these words beginning in 24:13. Now on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all the things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And Jesus said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stopped, stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered Jesus, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place in these days?" Jesus asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things of Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all of this, it is now the third day since these things took place. Moreover, some women in our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and they did not find the body there. And they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that Jesus was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb, and they found it as the women had said, but they did not see him." Then Jesus said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets had declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah would suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all of the prophets, Jesus interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near to the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it's almost evening and the day is now nearly over." He went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, he blessed it, and he broke it, and he gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" The very same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 of their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." Then the two told what had happened to them on the road and what had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. May God add blessing to our reading and understanding of these words. That story of the two disciples on the way to Emmaus is one of my very favorites, but I want you to think for just a moment as we get started today about what journey you might be on right now. What are you moving towards? What are you working for? What are you waiting for? My wife and I are on a journey that we're expecting our first child this June, a baby girl. But we have some friends who are on a different journey, on a fertility journey. They're hoping to get pregnant. It's been interesting for me to think about that for them, where we are feels like an end, and for us it feels very much like we're still on the journey. Maybe yours looks more like a quest for purpose, for fulfillment, for work that fulfills you, or a vocation that is meaningful, something that you can do with your hands and perhaps earn a living at, that will bring you some sort of deep sense of meaning. Or maybe you're not looking for a deep sense of satisfaction. Instead, you just want peace, just a new normal, just a place past grief and regret. Maybe you're waiting on medical answers. Or maybe you're journeying with a loved one, a spouse, a parent, perhaps even a child, somebody for whom there will be no medical answers as their bodies and their faculties begin to fail them. Is yours a journey towards the end of a large project professionally, towards retirement, towards freedom from debt? Or are there some other big milestones in your life, something with a hobby, waiting to see how a new friendship, a new relationship will pan out? Maybe you're looking for faith that works, for a spiritual connection, for community. What else could it be? Maybe we think of it less as a journey and more as something that we're hoping for. Is there something that you're hoping for? Maybe you're still a little cautious, looking at the terrain, looking at the layout of the land, deciding if you want to begin the journey at all. The writer of the Gospel according to Luke and of Acts, those are two volumes of basically the same story. The author of that seems to be really interested in this idea of a journey. We see that in various ways, but probably no more clearly than in chapter 9, verse 51, when Luke says that Jesus sets his face towards Jerusalem as as his days were coming to a close, he sets his face towards Jerusalem. And the rest of the story is a journey from Galilee to Jerusalem that will lead to the cross and to the empty grave. And then Jesus will ascend into heaven. And it is all set in this journey, this travelogue, this direction as Jesus moves from one place to the other. The whole of the gospel almost is set in this journey. I love that imagery. Then in Acts, the author comes back to this over and over again, as the people who follow Jesus are called the followers of the journey, or the followers of the way. We see that repeated all throughout. Luke is really interested in this idea of a journey. And so it's interesting to me, and I think it's significant that on this morning, as we come later in the day of the resurrection into this story, the disciples are headed on a journey a different way. After this bizarre story of Jesus' body gone missing, the two disciples set out on a journey towards Emmaus, away from Jerusalem. They turn their backs, they depart, they walk away. In chapter 9, it said that Jesus set his face towards Jerusalem. They turn the other direction and head back home. Friends, maybe the word for you this morning, maybe what you need to hear is that sometimes we're on the wrong journey. Maybe you know that to be true. Maybe you know that you're in a place that doesn't feel quite right. Sometimes we're on the wrong journey. It would seem that these friends are on the wrong journey. They'd been on a long journey with Jesus, and now they were going in a different direction. Now they were on a slow, long, and sad journey back. Notice that they weren't going forward, they were going back to normal. They had hoped, but they didn't have any hope. That's what they said to Jesus before they recognized him. They had hoped, but then their hopes were dashed. All of it had been for naught. All their time had been wasted. All their time had been spent, and nothing became of it. The investment, the devotion, their effort. All those people who laughed at them and said this was foolishness, turns out they were right. So these two disciples, they found themselves forlorn because they bothered to hope. Who even bothers to hope anymore? Who could be that audacious? Who bothers to hope? They were silly enough to hope. Of course they were let down. Sometimes when that happens to us, I mean, that when we bother to help and hope and then we get let down, sometimes we begin to live a little bit differently. Sometimes when we have the courage to hope and things don't come to fruition, when we decide to embark on the journey, but it doesn't go in the place, to the conclusion that we thought it would. Sometimes when we've been disappointed one too many times, we start to manage our hopes. And by that I mean we stop having them. We stop hoping it'll get better or different. We get jaded. We begin to manage our expectations. I remember one time many years ago, I had somehow gotten on the email list for Frontier Airlines. And this was when Frontier Airlines was moving from a discount airline to a deep discount airline, whatever the next level of that is, where they exist now. And so I got this email as they were beginning to make that transition. It was from the CEO, and he began to lay out the changes that were going to be made. And he said in the email that his goal of the email was to manage expectations. I've used that phrase many times in my life. Sometimes when people would say, I'm so excited to meet you, I'd say, please manage your expectations. Sometimes if you know someone's going to a place that's got a lot of hype, or going to see a movie that's got a lot of hype, but you don't think it's that good, you might tell them, hey, just sort of check yourself a little bit. Maybe don't get too excited. We begin to manage our expectations about the world when we get disappointed. T.S. Eliot calls the human condition learning to avoid excessive expectation. Sometimes we've learned not to hope for too much, not to ask for too much, not to get too excited. Our friends in our scripture reading, they're on this long, slow, sad journey back from their excessive expectations and back to normal, back from what they had hoped, back from the journey they thought was going somewhere magnificent, somewhere monumental and marvelous, and they're going back to some place that is just mundane. Sarah Bessey talks about this passage as a sort of an illustration of what Proverbs 13:12 says. that a hope deferred makes the heart sick. Hope dashed makes the heart sick. Hope demolished and crushed and crucified and dead makes the heart sick. The disciples say, we had hoped. So let me say something here. There are journeys in life. There are some times in life in which we need to just sit and wait. I think there's probably somebody this morning who the word for them is not that you're on the wrong journey, but instead that you need to sit and wait, that when hope has run ragged and when the rope has worn thin and when it feels like defeat is sort of setting in, closing in on us, sometimes we need to hear that we just need to sit and wait. When it feels like the road is over, we need to remain in that journey. We need to trust and we need to sit and we need to wait. Our friends said they had hoped. They were on a journey. They were going to Jerusalem. They were following Jesus. It was a costly journey. But then things got dark. Then things looked bleak. Then things looked like they were dead and over. And they got up from that journey and they went back the direction that they were going before. They traded the journey of following Jesus for a different one. And they almost missed things because of it. I think that perhaps some of us need to hear this day that when the journey gets rough, we need to sit and we need to wait and we need to trust and we need to hang on and we need to huddle or hide or pray or do whatever it takes just to spend a few moments longer on that journey, because Jesus may be showing up in some way that we couldn't ask for or imagine. That hope may just walk through a locked door and say, guess what? I'm alive. I'm here. I'm back. Let's do things. It's not for everyone. It's not for always. It's not for every season and every journey and every place in life. But I think that sometimes we need to be reminded that God isn't done with the good things that we've been called to yet. And when we thought it was finished, God said it ain't over. So if you're in despair, maybe you just need to be reminded to wait. And maybe you need to be reminded to remain. And maybe you need a word this morning from our scriptures that you can be sustained in your hope through this season, as challenging as it may be. Maybe you need to be reminded to wait and to trust that God isn't finished with the thing that God has called you to yet. Our friends on the road, they almost missed it because they didn't wait. But luckily for them, even as they went back to where they were before, Jesus came and chased them down. They almost missed it. But God came and found them. And isn't that ever the great news? But God. They almost missed it. They almost got left behind, but God. They didn't recognize Jesus. But they're on that journey to Emmaus. They're on that journey away from Jerusalem. When they couldn't wait any longer, God was there. On that wrong journey, on that wrong road, in the wrong direction, Jesus showed up, and that is good news for us, friends. And he begins to explain to them things in ways that they'd never heard before. Now, notice I didn't say he begins to explain to them things that they have never been told before, but he begins to explain it and they hear it differently. Do you understand the difference in that? And then all of a sudden what happens is that something within them awakens, at least awakens enough for them to invite, and in fact actually to urge this stranger to come and be their guest. And what happens in that meal is what happens every time we partake in this meal, a great and holy mystery. Bread and juice, table and a community of people, prayers, and all of a sudden God shows up. It's a mystery. But somehow God is there when we take that bread, when you take that bread and you receive it, when we share it together. Somehow there's some clarity that comes from that. Somehow something happens, not just around these disciples, but within them. Something that they had been missing. And Jesus there at the table, with that new sense of clarity, meeting them in the meal, changes everything. The hope that had died is alive once again. And one of the things that we learn from our friends who are on the road to Emmaus is that we can hope again. We who have been hurt and become jaded, we who have traded in our journeys for an old one, we who have turned back, we who have managed our expectations, we who once said we had hoped, can now say again, we have hope. Because when it seems like all has died and everything was lost, Jesus shows up. Jesus chases them down and says it's okay to trust again, to hope again, to live again, to love again. Part of the story of this day is that you can't out-hope Jesus. You can't out-dream God. There's no idea that you have that's too big or too lofty or too simple or too profound or too wonderful or too amazing. You can't hold on too long, too hard, too fast, or too much. So what is that journey that you're on that we talked about right at the beginning for purpose, for satisfaction, for faith or family, for a new project or a new perspective? Whatever it is that you're hoping for, know that God is there with you on the journey. Jesus is beside you, walking beside you, working within you. So keep on pushing forward and trust that God is in the midst of what God calls us to. The disciples there at the table, as Jesus has broken the bread, they get to live the other half of that proverb, 13:12. So it begins by saying that a hope deferred makes the heart sick. Do you remember how it ends? It says a hope fulfilled is a tree of life, a longing fulfilled, a desire fulfilled. And what is that? It's a tree of life. It's a fountain of blessing, a respite for the weary traveler, a stronghold in the storm. And all those hopes that had been dashed, they come storming back in. All of the things that they thought were dead suddenly seem alive. The world which seemed bleak suddenly seemed bright. But it's more than that, because they realized the hopes that they had before, those containers weren't even big enough, because God was doing something bigger. The visions and the dreams that they had, the direction they thought they were going, that wasn't even big enough, because we couldn't have possibly hoped. They couldn't have possibly hoped for something that was this big and that good. Cleopas and his friend, their hope is suddenly fulfilled, and it was bigger than they ever thought. And they realized we got to go back on that journey. We got to get back to those people, to our friends. We got to get back on track. And they find out, as we find out, that a part of this road that we're on is the journey from isolation to community. And maybe that's the message for you in this story today. Maybe you need to be reminded of our need for community. Maybe you've given up hope on connection, on vulnerability, on trusting other people. Maybe you've given up on a neighbor or a particular part of your family or those political opponents or some political figure or some process. Maybe you're stressed out and burned out, or maybe you've become just too comfortable with your relative isolation. Maybe you begin to think that risking relationship feels too scary. I think part of what this story illustrates for us is that the journey of the people of God is always one that takes us from isolation to connectedness, from self to collected, from alone to together, from individuals to community. And so they run back. What's another 7 miles today, right? Anyway, they run back to their excessive expectations, to all of their hopes and all of the wonder. They run back to community, and they say that the Lord has risen indeed. So for whatever journey you're on, hope is alive and well. There is a message of grace, a promise of life, a gift of love. And you go not on that journey alone. Jesus is with you, and this community is with you. We're not meant to do life by ourselves. Fear and loss and grief would drive us to isolation, would turn the disciples away from Jerusalem with their backs to what they knew. But the journey of hope brought them back into community and invites us to do the same. I just have one more thing that I want to say. When they return to and are reunited with community, what happens? What becomes of them? What comes out of that resurrected hope? It becomes a vehicle of blessing that has changed the course of history, that has impacted the world and continues to impact our community and communities around the world by all those who are gathered under the banner of Jesus. It's not a perfect collective, the church. It's not without its flaws, but it has become a blessing to you and to me and to many. It's intended to be a blessing for the world. That's the tree of life and the family tree that comes out of that longing fulfilled, that hope fulfilled in that day. When that journey gets fulfilled, what becomes is something that they couldn't have possibly asked for or imagined. But truthfully, that shouldn't be all that much of a surprise. I want to borrow one more time from Sarah Bessie as we wrap up. She asks, what is that tree of life? A hope fulfilled is a tree of life. We see that same phrase in the very last chapter of our scriptures in Revelation. It says that there on the banks of the river containing the water of life, bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God, there is the tree of life with its 12 kinds of fruit, and the leaves of that tree are for the healing of the nations. It was so much bigger than they thought. It is so much bigger than we thought. You thought it was just about healing your hope? I mean, it is. It's about that. This journey is about that, but it's also about so much more. It's about moving into that resurrected hope from isolation to community, no more managing expectations. And the people of the journey that emerge from that, the people of the way that Luke has been talking about, we are for the healing of the nations. And friends, we have so much work to do. So may we come to find that God is with us, that Jesus is on the journey, and may your hope be fulfilled, even when it looks far different than you ever could have asked or imagined, and may you find excessive expectation once again, and may we all be compelled to work together for the healings of this nation and all nations in this time and this place and all days. Friends, thank you for worshiping with us. Go in peace. I would invite you to enjoy this last song and then be sent into the world to work for that healing of the nations. Amen.